Mary was always a creature of habit. Every Friday morning she treated herself to a caramel latte and a quiet hour of reading at her favorite café before heading to her afternoon lecture. It was her sanctuary. Small, cozy, and tucked away from the noise of the city. She loved the familiar hum of background chatter, the comforting hiss of the espresso machine, and the faint aroma of baked goods mingling with freshly brewed coffee. For Mary, it was the perfect escape from the stress of university life and the subtle pressures of navigating adulthood. That morning started like any other. She arrived at the cafe, book in hand, and ordered her usual drink. Finding her favorite spot by the window, she settled into the worn leather armchair and began flipping through the pages of her novel. Outside, the sky was a dull gray, hinting at rain later in the day, but Mary didn't mind. She had always found the rain soothing, especially when she was safely indoors. She was halfway through a chapter when movement across the room caught her eye. Mary glanced up casually, expecting to see a barista or another customer, but her gaze froze mid-mation. There, seated at a corner table, was her dad. At first, she smiled faintly. Her father loved coffee, and it wasn't unusual for him to stop by a cafe on his way to work. But something about the scene didn't sit right. He wasn't alone. Across from him sat a woman Mary didn't recognize. She was striking, blonde, elegantly dressed, and maybe 10 years younger than her dad. The two of them were leaning in close, their heads almost touching as they spoke in hushed tones. They weren't just talking. They were laughing, sharing private smiles, and there was a kind of familiarity between them that Mary couldn't ignore. Her stomach. Mary's first instinct was to dismiss her feelings. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe this woman was a work colleague or an old friend he hadn't mentioned. Her dad, Ethan, was a warm and charismatic man, the kind of person who could make anyone feel at ease. He worked as a sales director for a large company, a role that often required him to network and build relationships. It wasn't unusual for him to meet with clients or colleagues outside the office, but even as Mary tried to rationalize what she was seeing, her gut told her something was off. She tried to refocus on her book, but the words blurred together on the page. Her attention kept drifting back to her dad and the mystery woman. Mary noticed the way her dad leaned slightly toward her, how he rested his hand casually on the table, his fingers just inches from hers. The woman laughed at something he said, tilting her head back in a way that seemed almost flirtatious. Mary's chest tightened further. She couldn't ignore the sense of intimacy between them. It was a kind of closeness she had never seen between her parents. Her heart raced as questions flooded her mind. Who was this woman? Why was her dad here with her instead of at work? Did her mom know about this meeting? Mary felt a pang of guilt at the thought. Her mom, Diane, was the kind of woman who put everyone else first. She worked tirelessly to keep their family running smoothly, juggling her job as a school administrator with the endless demands of home life. Mary couldn't shake the feeling that if Diane knew about this, it would break her heart. Mary glanced at the time on her phone. It was just after 10 a.m., not exactly peak hours for a business meeting. She tried to convince herself it was harmless, that there was a logical explanation, but the longer she watched, the harder it was to believe that. Her dad's smile was different. Softer, almost shy. And when the woman reached across the table to touch his hand, Mary felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. She debated what to do. Should she go over there and say hello? If this was innocent, then there was no reason not to, but what if it wasn't? The idea of confronting her dad in public made her stomach churn. She could already imagine the awkwardness, the excuses, the forced laughter as he tried to downplay the situation. And what if he got angry? What if he told her to mind her own business? Mary didn't know if she was ready to face that possibility. Instead, she stayed frozen in her seat, her mind racing. She felt like an intruder, like she was witnessing something she was never meant to see. A small part of her wanted to take a picture, to capture this moment as proof, but the thought made her feel sick. This was her dad, the man who had taught her how to ride a bike, who had helped her with math homework, who had always been her biggest supporter. The idea of spying on him, of doubting him, felt wrong on every level. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Mary's coffee grew cold as she sat there, torn between confronting him and walking away. Finally, she made a decision. She wasn't ready to deal with this. Not here, not now. Gathering her things, she slipped out of the cafe as quietly as she could, hoping her dad wouldn't notice her. She didn't look back. As she stepped into the cool morning air, Mary felt a wave of emotions crash over her. Confusion, anger, sadness, and guilt all at once. She didn't know what to think, what to feel, or what to do next. All she knew was that something had changed. The man she had always trusted, the man she had looked up to her entire life, suddenly felt like a stranger. And the worst part was, she had no idea if she was overreacting or if her world was about to fall apart. Mary spent the rest of the day in a daze. Her lecture felt like background noise, and she barely spoke to her friends. She kept replaying the scene in her mind, analyzing every detail, searching for clues she might have missed. The way they laughed together, the way their eyes lingered on each other, it all seemed too intimate to ignore. But the more she thought about it, the more uncertain she felt. Was she imagining things? Was she letting her emotions cloud her judgment? That night, Mary lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't shake the image of her dad and the mystery woman from her mind. The more she thought about it, the more questions she had. Was this the first time they had met, or had this been going on for a while? Did her mom suspect anything, or was she completely in the dark? And Mary didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear. She couldn't ignore this. Whatever was happening, she needed to know the truth, even if it meant uncovering something she didn't want to see. For the next few days, Mary couldn't shake the image of her father and the woman at the cafe. It haunted her, replaying in her mind like a scene from a film she desperately wanted to forget. She tried to convince herself it wasn't her place to get involved, that she might have misread the situation, but the uneasy feeling in her chest refused to go away. Her dad's smile, the way the woman touched his hand, it all felt too deliberate, too intimate to ignore. At home, things seemed normal on the surface. Her mom was her usual self, bustling around the kitchen in the mornings and chatting about work. Her dad didn't seem any different, either. He cracked jokes during dinner and asked Mary about her classes. But now, every interaction felt tainted. Mary watched her dad more closely, noticing things she had never paid attention to before. The way he glanced at his phone during family meals, the moments when he seemed distracted or preoccupied. Each detail felt like a piece of a puzzle she couldn't quite put together. One evening, Mary sat in her room, staring at her laptop. She had a term paper due in a few days, but she hadn't made any progress. Her mind was elsewhere. Finally, she grabbed her phone and dialed the number of her best friend, Lily. "Hey, Em," Lily answered cheerfully. "What's up?" Mary hesitated. She hadn't told anyone about what she'd seen, not because she didn't trust Lily, but because saying it out loud would make it feel more real. But the weight of the secret was crushing her, and she needed to tell someone. "Can I ask you something?" Mary began, her voice shaky. "Of course. What's going on?" Mary took a deep breath and launched into the story, recounting everything she'd seen at the cafe. She described her dad, the woman, the way they'd interacted. By the time she finished, her hands were trembling. "Wow," Lily said after a long pause. "That's a lot. Are you sure you're not jumping to conclusions? I mean, it could have been. That's what I keep telling myself," Mary said. "But it didn't feel innocent, Lily. You didn't see them. The way they were looking at each other, it wasn't just a work thing." Lily was quiet for a moment. "Okay, so what are you going to do? Are you going to talk to him?" "I don't know," Mary admitted. "What if I'm wrong? What if I accuse him of something he didn't do? But what if I'm right? I don't know what to do." "Well," Lily said carefully, "I think you need to figure out the truth before you do anything. If you confront him now and you're wrong, it could cause a huge fight for no reason. But if you're right, your mom deserves to know, Em." The thought of her mom made Mary's chest ache. Diane had always been the rock of their family, the person who kept everything running smoothly. Mary couldn't bear the thought of hurting her, but she also knew she couldn't ignore this forever. "Yeah," Mary said finally. "You're right. I just need to figure out what's really going on." Over the next few days, Mary kept a close eye on her dad. She noticed that he was spending more time on his phone than usual, often stepping out of the room to take calls. When she asked him about it casually, he shrugged and said it was work. She wanted to believe him, but the nagging doubt in her mind wouldn't let her. One afternoon, Mary decided to check their family calendar, a shared app they all used to keep track of appointments and events. Her dad had a meeting scheduled for 5 p.m. at a location he hadn't mentioned before. Mary's heart raced as she stared at the screen. Was it just a regular work meeting, or was he seeing her again? She debated whether to follow him, feeling like a character in a bad soap opera. But the curiosity was too strong to resist. At 4:30, Mary grabbed her coat and keys, telling her mom she was heading out to study at the library. She drove to the address listed in the calendar, parking a few blocks away to avoid being seen. Her hands were clammy as she waited, her eyes glued to the entrance of the small office building. At exactly 5 p.m., her dad's car pulled up. Mary watched as he got out wearing a suit and carrying his briefcase. For a moment, she felt relieved. He looked like he was heading to a legitimate business meeting. But then, a familiar figure stepped out of the building. The blonde woman from the cafe. She greeted her dad with a warm smile, and they walked inside together. But Mary's stomach dropped. The sight confirmed everything she'd been dreading. She sat frozen in her car, gripping the steering wheel as a whirlwind of emotions consumed her. Anger, sadness, disbelief. She had hoped deep down that she was wrong, but now there was no denying it. She considered going inside, confronting him on the spot, but the thought terrified her. Instead, she pulled out her phone and took a quick photo of the two of them entering the building. It felt invasive and wrong, but she needed proof. If she decided to tell her mom, she needed something concrete. Mary drove home in silence, her mind racing. She felt like she was living in a nightmare, one she couldn't wake up from. When she got home, her mom was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. Diane greeted her with a smile, asking how her study session went. Mary mumbled a response, avoiding eye contact. She felt sick with guilt, like she was betraying her mom by keeping this secret. That night, Mary lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't stop thinking about what she'd seen. The image of her dad and the woman together was burned into her mind. She thought about her mom, about how much she loved and trusted her dad. Telling her would destroy that trust, but staying silent felt just as wrong. Mary knew she couldn't keep this to herself forever. She had to make a choice, confront her dad privately or tell her mom everything. Either way, the truth was going to come out, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same. Mary spent the next morning in a fog, barely able to concentrate on her classes or the conversations around her. She had hardly slept the night before, the image of her dad walking into the office building with the blonde woman replaying in her mind over and over again. Every time she thought about it, her chest tightened, a mix of anger and sadness welling up inside her. She couldn't decide what was worse, the possibility that her dad was betraying their family, or the fact that she had to be the one to deal with it. She wished she could just unsee it all, erase the memory and go back to the way things were. But that wasn't possible. The truth was out there now, hanging over her like a storm cloud, and Mary knew it wouldn't go away until she confronted it head-on. That evening, she decided to talk to her dad. She couldn't keep this bottled up any longer. It was eating her alive. After dinner, as her mom headed upstairs to take a shower, Mary lingered in the kitchen, waiting for the right moment. Her dad was rinsing dishes at the sink, humming softly to himself, completely unaware of the turmoil swirling inside her. "Dad," Mary said, her voice wavering slightly. "Can we talk?" Ethan glanced over his shoulder, surprised by the serious tone in her voice. "Of course," he said, turning off the water and drying his hands. Mary hesitated, her heart pounding. She had rehearsed this conversation in her head a dozen times, but now that the moment was here, she didn't know how to begin. I saw you the other day," she blurted out finally. "At the café." Her dad's expression shifted ever so slightly. Just a flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise? Worry? Mary couldn't tell. "Oh," he said, keeping his tone light. "You were at the café? I didn't see you." "I saw you," Mary said firmly. "You were with a woman." Ethan froze for a moment, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. He glanced at her, then quickly looked away, as if trying to decide how to respond. "Mary," he said after a long pause, "that was just a work meeting. Nothing to worry about." Mary crossed her arms, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "It didn't look like a work meeting," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "You were laughing with her, leaning in close. It looked like more than that." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Mary, I know how it might have looked, but you're reading too much into it. She's a colleague, someone I've worked with for years, that's all." Mary shook her head, anger rising in her chest. "Don't lie to me, Dad. I followed you yesterday. I saw you meet her again, at the office building. You didn't tell Mom where you were going. You said it was a meeting, but it wasn't." Her dad's face turned pale, and for the first time, Mary saw real fear in his eyes. "You followed me?" he said, his voice low. "Yes," Mary said, refusing to back down. "I followed you because I needed to know the truth, and now I do. You're hiding something, Dad. Don't try to deny it." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He looked away, his shoulders slumping. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the hum of the refrigerator. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh. "Mary," he said quietly, I don't know how to explain this to you." "You explain it by telling me the truth," Mary shot back. "Are you cheating on Mom?" Her dad flinched at the word, his face etched with guilt. "It's not what you think," he said finally. "It's complicated." Mary felt a surge of anger. "What does that even mean? Either you're cheating or you're not. There's nothing complicated about it." Ethan sighed again, his expression pained. "I've been seeing her for a few months," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not serious. It's just something that happened. I never meant for you to find out, and I never meant to hurt you or your mom." Mary stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her dad, the man she had looked up to her entire life, was admitting to having an affair. It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. "How could you do this?" she said, her voice shaking. "How could you do this to Mom, to our family?" Ethan looked down at the floor, unable to meet her eyes. "I don't have an excuse," he said. "I've been unhappy for a while. Your mom and we've been drifting apart. I didn't know how to fix it, and then this just happened." Mary felt tears welling up in her eyes. "So instead of trying to fix your marriage, you decided to cheat? To throw everything away?" "I didn't want to throw anything away," Ethan said desperately. "I still love your mom. I still love our family. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake." Mary shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "A mistake? This isn't just a mistake, Dad. This is a choice. You chose to lie to Mom. You chose to betray her. How do you expect me to trust you after this?" Ethan's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like a broken man. "Mary, I know I've let you down. I know I've let everyone down. But please, please don't tell your mom. Not yet. Let me figure out how to fix this." Mary stared at him, her mind racing. She couldn't believe he was asking her to keep this a secret. to protect him after everything he had done. "You want me to lie to her?" she said, her voice trembling with disbelief. "You want me to pretend everything's fine while you figure out what to do?" "Mary, please," Ethan said, his voice pleading. "I need time. I need to figure out how to make this right. I don't want to hurt her." "She's already hurt," Mary said sharply. "She just doesn't know it yet, and when she finds out, and she will find out, it's going to hurt even more that we kept it from her." Ethan didn't respond. He just stood there, looking defeated, as if the weight of his actions had finally caught up to him. Mary felt a surge of anger, not just at him but at the entire situation. She hated that he had put her in this position, that he had made her a part of his betrayal. "I can't do this," she said finally, her voice breaking. "I can't lie to her. She deserves to know the truth." With that, Mary turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her dad standing there in silence. As she climbed the stairs to her room, she felt a mix of anger, sadness, and guilt swirling inside her. She didn't know how she was going to tell her mom, or if she even could, but one thing was certain: their family would never be the same. Mary barely slept that night. Her mind replayed the conversation with her dad over and over again, each word cutting deeper than the last. She had always thought of him as her rock, steady, dependable, someone who would never let her or her mom down. Now, she couldn't reconcile the image of the man she had trusted her whole life with the man who had just confessed to betraying their family. By morning, her decision was clear. She couldn't keep this secret, not when it threatened to tear apart everything her family had built. Her mom deserved the truth, no matter how much it hurt. But the weight of what she was about to do felt unbearable. She rehearsed the conversation in her mind, trying to find the right words. But nothing felt adequate. How do you tell someone their world is about to collapse? That afternoon, Mary found her mom in the living room, folding laundry while a cooking show played softly in the background. Diane looked up and smiled when Mary entered, her face calm and unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. "Hey, sweetheart," Diane said, patting the spot on the couch next to her. "What's up?" Mary hesitated, her heart pounding. Her mom's warm, familiar presence made what she was about to do even harder. She sat down slowly, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Mom," she began, her voice trembling, "I need to talk to you about something. Something important." Diane's smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "Of course, honey, what's wrong?" Mary took a deep breath, forcing herself to meet her mom's eyes. "It's about Dad," she said quietly. "There's something you need to know." Diane's brow furrowed and she set down the shirt she had been folding. "What about him?" Mary's throat felt tight, and for a moment she thought she might not be able to say it. But then the image of her dad and the blonde woman flashed in her mind, and she knew she couldn't stay silent. I think he's been seeing someone else," Mary said, her voice barely above a whisper. Diane stared at her, confusion and disbelief flickering across her face. "What are you talking about?" Mary explained everything. How she had seen him at the cafe, how she had followed him to the office building, how he had admitted to her the night before that he'd been seeing another woman. She tried to keep her voice steady, but it cracked under the weight of the truth. By the time she finished, Diane looked like she had been punched in the gut. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her mouth. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, he wouldn't do that." "I'm so sorry, Mom," Mary said, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't want to believe it either, but I saw them together, and when I confronted him, he admitted it. He said it's been going on for months." Diane's shoulders slumped, and for a moment she seemed to collapse in on herself. Mary reached out to touch her arm, but Diane pulled away, standing up and pacing the room instead. "I don't understand," Diane said, her voice trembling. "How could he do this, after everything, after all these years?" Mary didn't know what to say. She had asked herself the same questions, but there were no answers that could make it right. Diane suddenly stopped pacing and turned to Mary, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and determination. "I need to talk to him," she said. "I need to hear it from him." Mary nodded, her heart aching for her mom. "I'll be here if you need me," she said softly. When Ethan came home that evening, the tension in the house was palpable. Diane was waiting for him in the kitchen, her face set with a quiet resolve. Mary stayed in her room, but she could hear every word of their conversation through the thin walls. At first, Ethan tried to deny it, his voice defensive and strained. But Diane didn't let him off the hook. She pressed him, demanding the truth, and eventually, Ethan broke down. He admitted everything. How he had met the woman through work, how their relationship had started innocently but had spiraled into something more. He insisted it wasn't serious, that it didn't mean anything, but Diane wasn't having it. "It didn't mean anything?" Diane's voice was sharp, filled with anger and betrayal. "You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around behind my back, and you expect me to believe it didn't mean anything? Do you have any idea what you've done to this family?" Ethan's response was muffled, but Mary could hear the desperation in his voice. "I'm sorry," he said over and over again. "I never wanted to hurt you. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. Please, Diane, let me fix this. Let me make it right." There was a long silence, and for a moment Mary thought her mom might forgive him. But then Diane's voice came through, quiet, but firm. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Ethan," she said. "You didn't just hurt me. You hurt Mary, too. You broke the trust that held this family together, and I don't know if we can ever get that back." Mary felt tears streaming down her face as she listened. She wanted to run downstairs, to comfort her mom, but she knew this was something they had to work through on their own. Over the next few weeks, the house felt like a war zone. Diane and Ethan barely spoke, and when they did, it was tense and clipped. Diane had insisted that Ethan stay in the guest room while she decided what to do. Mary tried to be there for her mom as much as she could, but she also felt torn. Despite everything, a part of her still loved her dad and wanted to believe he could change. Eventually, Diane made her decision. One evening, she sat Mary down in the living room, her face calm but resolute. "I've thought about this a lot," Diane said, "and I've decided that I can't stay in this marriage. What your dad did, it broke something in me, and no amount of apologies or promises can fix that." Mary nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I understand," she said. Diane reached out and took her hand. "I'm sorry you had to go through this, sweetheart. None of this is your fault, and no matter what happens, we're going to be okay. I promise you that." In the weeks that followed, Diane filed for divorce and Ethan moved out of the house. It was a painful and messy process, but through it all, Mary saw a strength in her mom that she had never noticed before. Diane refused to let the betrayal define her or their family. She focused on rebuilding her life, one step at a time, and she encouraged Mary to do the same. As for Mary, the experience left her scarred but also wiser. She learned that even the people she loved most were capable of making mistakes, of letting her down, but she also learned the importance of honesty, of facing the truth, no matter how painful it might be. In the end, their family wasn't the same, but it wasn't entirely broken either. Diane and Ethan eventually found a way to co-parent amicably, and Mary maintained a cautious relationship with her dad. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and for Mary, that